To have this great crowd here for really what is an exciting panel we have. We have, no doubt, two of the most distinguished writers and really thinkers. Do you think at the New York Times?
Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. The other days we actually turn the paper out.
Part-time thinkers at the New York Times. And so, first of all, I'd like to mention the sponsors of this event before we get going. And of course, that's the C Center at our own Joseph Corbell School of International Studies, but also our Center for Middle East Studies, a very active new center that we have under Nader Hashmi, who I think is somewhere here. There he is. There he is. Nader, thanks for putting up your hand. I never would have found you. And of course, Danny Postal, who I think is in the back room, in the back of the room. And I should explain one thing we're trying to do is make sure we have the books that these gentlemen have written. Right now, we've got some box lunches, which are as digestible as the books, but nonetheless, we'd like to see if we can get the books here. So, so we have the Center for Middle East Studies as one of our sponsors. Also, DU's Department of Media, Film, and Journalism Studies. And I don't know who's responsible for that, but no one's... Oh, there they are. Good to see you here. And finally, the ESLO International Center for Journalism and New Media. So I think, there you are. I think a very appropriate group representing several corners of this university and putting together what I think will be a very interesting panel. And of course, what we're going to do today is to talk about the U.S. foreign policy challenges in the twilight of the Obama presidency. Now, twilight seems a little premature, what with there being some 3 years to go. But actually, the way it works in Washington, as soon as you have the midterm elections, that is in 2014, just a year from now, people start thinking about the 2016 elections. And you have an ism that creeps in called lame duck-ism. And so you have an administration that really has to start looking at its legacy and looking at what issues it can really take on in those in the remaining months. So what better people to talk about this than to have David Sanger, who's the chief Washington correspondent for the New York Times. He's reported really from all over the world. He was bureau chief in Tokyo for a time as well. He reports on all kinds of issues involving foreign policy, globalization, nuclear proliferation, Asian affairs, and he also reports on how we sometimes spy on our allies' leaders' cell phones. And I think we'll have some discussion on that, and whether the cost and benefit of spying on our allies, leaders, cell phones is really, although we know that when Andrea Merkel has to stop off and buy a quart of milk on the way home, we now know about that. But anyway, I look forward to some discussion of when you look at Intel, you always look at the gains, and then you look at the risks and sometimes what's known as blowback. And I think we're very much feeling that, and I think it would be interesting to discuss how that will affect the foreign policy in the next, in the remaining months. David Sanger has been particularly prolific on issues dear to my heart, that is nuclear issues and technology issues, nuclear issues with respect to Iran and North Korea. And of course, he's also been the person who has really, I think, developed a tremendous expertise on cyber warfare and drones, two aspects of foreign policy today. Oh, their books are here. Great, okay. Anyone who wants to buy, well, hey, here, I'll get around. I'm writing a book, so I'm really into advertising books these days. So, you can buy it, get it signed, and not even read it, but, you know, please do buy it. I'll get around to the books in a second. So David has written, he's broken many stories. I remember when I was doing North Korea, you broke a couple of stories.
Some of them were even right?
Some of them were even right. I stole my line there. But David is the author of 2 books, The Inheritance, The World Obama Confronts, and the Challenges to American Power. That was in 2009. And that was really a book about all the stuff, I'll use that word, that the Obama administration had to inherit from the previous administration. And more recently, The Confront and Conceal, Obama's Secret Wars and Surprising Use of American Power. And that came out just this year in 2013. Our second panelist is Stephen Kinzer, also an extraordinary journalist, foreign correspondent, award-winning correspondent, covered over 50 countries and 5 continents. He's been the New York bureau chief in Managua, Berlin, and Istanbul. He's done many books, and I tell you, having done one, I cannot imagine doing a second, but Stephen has done The Brothers, John Foster Dulles, Alan Dulles, and their Secret World War. That's the most recent, 2013. Also have done Reset, Iran, Turkey, and America's Future in 2010. 1,000 Hills, Rwanda's Rebirth and the Man Who Dreamed It, 2008. Overthrow, America's Century of Regime Change from Hawaii to Iraq. That'll be interesting. That was a while ago, and I have to read that. All the Shah's Men, American Coup and Roots of Middle East Terror, and finally Crescent and Star, Turkey Between Two Worlds. It's just an extraordinary output of really key books with a first-hand knowledge of these subjects. He's also a contributor. This is kind of a plug for our own guys here. He's a contributor to the book The People Reloaded, The Green Movement and the Struggle for Iran's Future, co-edited by Nader Hashmi and Danny Postel of our Center for Middle East Studies. Is that available for purchase? Oh, okay. You can't buy that one, but you can order it on Amazon.com. Also, Stephen has taught journalism and international affairs at Northwestern University, Boston University. Actually, David, you're teaching at Harvard.
Yeah.
Do I understand correctly? So, and is a columnist for Guardian and writes frequently for the New York Review of Books. So these are 2 extraordinarily accomplished people, and I think we're going to have a good discussion. So what I'm going to do is kind of prompt them with a couple of issues, and I think let them roll, because I think these neither David nor Stephen needs much coaching in how to expound on some of these key issues. But in order to have some structure, I thought maybe we'd talk about some of the major challenges, and I do want to talk about Syria. And maybe we could start with Stephen to talk about whether this administration talked about a pivot away from the Middle East toward East Asia, and there seem to be a few unintended consequences of that pivot. And one of those unintended consequences, if I can kind of expound on this for just a second, is that there's a perception that the U.S. kind of withdrew from the Middle East. And Stephen, I wonder if you can kind of riff off that question. Are we really withdrawing from the Middle East, or are we being totally sucked in again?
Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me here. This is really a wonderful opportunity and a great institution. It's amazing that in such quick succession the Korbel School was able to attract Nader Hashmi, then Danny Postel, and then Ambassador Hill. So that's really 3 big jumps in a very short time. And really, you're seeing some of the results of that right here in the school already. So it's an honor to be here in this company. Is the U.S. withdrawing from the Middle East? Is the period of our hegemony in the Middle East coming to an end? Unfortunately not. I think the long period of American hegemony in the Middle East has not worked out well for us. And I would like to see us reduce our footprint in that part of the world. It's a difficult needle to pull out of our arm. We've been so involved there for so long. But security considerations have changed as time has passed. You could have argued, for example, for a long time that despite all the deep problems that our relationship with Saudi Arabia has brought to us and brought to the world, during the Cold War, for strategic reasons and also because of our oil needs, we had to overlook most of the fundamental realities of Saudi Arabia. That time is over now. And when I see the Saudis becoming so angry at the United States and our foreign policy, I think it's about time. It's long overdue for us to take our separate paths. I believe really that in the end, interests are what dictate foreign policy. After a while, emotions and other factors fade away and people see countries see their interests more clearly, I think maybe the Saudis are starting to realize that their interests are fundamentally different from ours. Really, what's good for Saudi Arabia in many ways not good for us. Certainly we've seen that with the billions of our oil dollars that Saudi Arabia has invested in building these madrasas and mosques all over Central Asia and Africa and East Asia, in which whole generations of young boys have been taught how to memorize the Quran and hate America. So if this relationship is weakening a little bit, and these two countries, the United States and Saudi Arabia, are pursuing their own interests, I think that's healthy. As for the pivot away from the Middle East towards East Asia, I'm a little troubled by that concept because it seems as though we are deciding that we don't want to be the close-in hegemon in one place and we want to be the close-in hegemon somewhere else. What I would rather see is a reassessment of how the United States operates in the world. You know, when I was researching my book on the Dulles brothers, it so happened that in the Princeton Library where I was working, they also have the archives of the Council on Foreign Relations, which of course, for many years, now it's more or less kind of a think tank and a talking shop, but for many years it really was a very important center for the making of American foreign policy. And while I was doing that work, I realized something that I'd never known, that the Council on Foreign Relations has a motto. And it's actually written on every cover of Foreign Affairs magazine, and I'd never noticed it. So if you look at the logo, there's a Pegasus figure, a winged horse, with a little chicken scratch at the top, which I'd never looked at. But if you look at it very closely, it's one word. And that word is the motto of the Council on Foreign Relations. It's a Latin word, very nice, because you only want to be able to speak to people who can understand it. And that word is ubique. It means everywhere. That was the answer to many questions that people of those generations and that foreign policy turn of mind often asked. Where does the United States have vital interests? Where must the United States be heavily involved? Where does the United States need to guide the course of events? Everywhere. I think we're entering into a period where, for a variety of reasons, we're starting to reassess that. Now, looking specifically at the Middle East, and you mentioned Syria, I thought we had a really interesting moment a month or so ago when President Obama announced that he wanted to bomb Syria, but due to resistance in the public and in Congress, we never did. I think this is the first time in my lifetime that something like this has happened. I can't remember any time when a president of the United States wanted to bomb a country and people were against it. I'm not sure if this means that there is a fundamental change. Let's face it, we've taken a couple of big punches in the face in Afghanistan and Iraq. Maybe we're a little groggy, and as soon as we get the smelling salts, we'll be back in the ring punching again. But it may also be that we are starting to rethink this kind of intervention. And that maybe the pendulum is swinging a little bit, and maybe even the axis of the pendulum is moving. I think it's a little bit too early to say that. But just to talk about two little points, two specific points in the Middle East. I mentioned Saudi Arabia. Because of tremendous changes that have happened in the global energy supply picture in recent years, we are not big consumers of Saudi oil, as we have been for a long time. In fact, the biggest consumers of Saudi oil now, number one is China, and the other one is India. Now, what are China and India doing to guarantee the security of the Persian Gulf and their oil supply? Nothing. They don't have to, because we're doing it for them. We are providing the security for China's oil supply from the Persian Gulf. And the Chinese, I think, are very wise. They realize it's not going to be good for China in the long run to have battleships in the Persian Gulf and to have bases and soldiers in that part of the world. Let the Americans take all the flack for that, and we'll keep getting our oil for free. I think that's something that the United States needs to reassess. When we look at Syria, I think the United States did the right thing in not intervening there. On the other hand, I would like to see a more robust effort by the United States to pursue diplomacy. One of the things that has really irritated me about our approach to diplomacy in Syria is that we've been unable to put together a serious conference. They're now calling it the Geneva II Conference, which was supposed to be 6 months ago, then 3 months ago, then this month, and now we're still trying to get it going. There are several reasons why that conference hasn't gotten off the ground, but one of them is that the United States is very reluctant to sit at a table with Iran. And the other parties are saying, without Iran, we can't make a deal. So I would like to see the United States continue its reluctance to become involved militarily in Syria, but ratchet up the intensity of our diplomatic approach.
Okay. That would be a perfect segue for David maybe to talk a little about those Iran relations, because there is some heightened sense of optimism that maybe we can do something. It has to do, I should explain to both David and Stephen, the reason is they have a new foreign minister named Javed Zarif, who graduated from our school a few years ago and has learned so much. He's got all the right ideas about how to pursue this. So we're really excited about Zarif, and as soon as the FBI allows him to travel more than 25 miles from New York City, we hope to get him here.
I just saw him. I had dinner with him about a month ago at the UN, and he talks about his time in Denver, and he knows the country really well. And at one point, we said to him, "So, how much do you talk about this back in Tehran?" And the answer was not a whole lot, because his kids have gone to school here in the States and all that. And I think his biggest problem right now in selling the nuclear deal is that he is viewed as overly Americanized. So I think you may have to wait a little while till the deal's sort of initial before you're going to, get him to take up residence here. On the other hand, if the deal falls apart,
he could take up residence
right
here
now. Yeah.
So you'd have to watch out for your job.
Yeah.
Right.
So first, it's great to be back here. I was here a year ago just before the presidential debate on the campus, giving sort of an overall talk on American foreign policy, and was here also with Chris at the school, and it's great to be back and see such a great crowd. And we miss having Chris in D.C. He and I would get together once every couple of months, first to talk about the Red Sox, and then usually to talk about what were the 3 or 4 stupidest things that we had seen happen in Washington since the last time we got together. And the list got so long, we frequently never actually made it to North Korea and Syria and everything else. But we had a good time. So let me get to Iran by amplifying on and slightly disagreeing with my friend Steve here on where Obama is in trying to disengage from the Middle East. He's pretty explicit about it. He does not, this is not something that in the first term they hid very much. I spent a lot of time in Confront and Conceal, the book that Chris mentioned that came out just last year, discussing the light footprint strategy. And the light footprint strategy was based on the theory that the days were over when Americans would put up with sending 100,000 troops to a country for 6 or 7 years, occupying the place, giving a lot of speeches about how we were going to turn it into a beacon of democracy in the Middle East, and then discovering that we had built up resentments along the way in doing that. And Chris was on the receiving end of a few of those resentments in Iraq. So the light footprint strategy is about using new technologies, whether it is drones or cyber warfare, kind of attacks that we did on the Iranian nuclear program, or special forces. Think of the bin Laden raid, but think of the 14 other raids that went on that night in Afghanistan, that same night that you didn't hear as much about. These are all techniques to try to go in and try to defend American interests without sticking around. And it has led to this perception, which I think is not entirely inaccurate, that the United States is sort of in a self-containment mode these days. And you saw it in the Syria debate that Steve referred to, which is that President Obama was deeply reluctant to strike Syria even after they had explicitly crossed a red line that he had set a year before, and after they crossed it in such a way that the administration could no longer deny it, as they had in the spring when there were smaller chemical weapons attacks that we reported on pretty vigorously, and the White House was busy trying to explain why these were not necessarily violations of the president's red line. But the fact remains that not only did the president not want to take this action, but that the Congress, even those who would have been significantly more hawkish a few years before, didn't want to get into anything that would have led to the perception that the United States was entering into another war. You not only heard this on the left from Nancy Pelosi's friends and those who elected President Obama thinking that he was the anti-war candidate instead of that he was the anti-Iraq war candidate, but you heard it from many on the right. In fact, one day I was driving around actually out in the West, and I heard Liz Cheney, who of course is running for Senate in Wyoming, on the radio talking about why the United States should not take action in Syria. And I'm stopping and I'm thinking, wait a minute, wasn't it her father who was arguing that we should bomb the Syrian reactor that was built with North Korean help in 2007 rather than have the Israelis bomb it, that we needed to send a message to the Iranians? So that gives you a sense of how much she perceived the public view had changed. So where does that take us in regards to the Iranian negotiations? President Obama said during the 2008 campaign that he was willing to go negotiate with our adversaries. Unfortunately, our adversaries were not willing at that time to negotiate back, with the possible exception of Burma. The North Koreans, there were never any discussions got going with. The Iranians got wrapped up in the violence that surrounded the 2009 election. And it wasn't until President Rouhani was elected and then Mr. Zarif, your grad, came in as his foreign minister, that these discussions really got going. So what are the chances that we are going to see a negotiated solution here? Well, they're back in Geneva today. The hope of the U.S. negotiators is that they would get a temporary standstill agreement in which Iran would stop producing new amounts of low-enriched uranium, and that during the 6 months or so of that hiatus, they would then be able to negotiate a much broader deal. This would be a deal mostly about the nuclear production, but over time, the U.S. would like to go to all those other issues you mentioned. Iran's interventions in Syria, Iran's interventions throughout the region, every place from Bahrain to Iraq, and perhaps that is possible. The difficulty here is twofold. First, the Iranians are much further along than they were when President Obama took office in 2009. January of 2009, they had a couple of thousand kilograms of low-enriched uranium, barely enough to make a bomb. Today, they have about 9,000 kilograms and could make several weapons. They had a couple thousand centrifuges running. Today, they have 18,000 centrifuges running. Those are the big floor-to-ceiling silvery machines that you see the pictures of, and those are the machines that were attacked in Olympic Games, or Stuxnet, the first U.S. Attempt to use a cyber weapon against another state. To make a deal work that we had confidence in, you'd actually have to get the Iranians to unbuild some of what they have been building. Very similar to what Chris negotiated with the North Koreans, and 5 years later, the North Koreans have been pretty successful, not entirely successful, at building that back up. But the reason you need to get them to back up and take apart some of what they have built in Iran is that otherwise you don't have enough warning time if they make a dash to a bomb. And so the thing to look for in these negotiations, past all of the noise and the happy talk and the administration saying they're making progress, is can they actually get back to something closer to where they were when President Obama came into office? The second problem you have is that in this negotiation, like in most negotiations, there's not going to be one deal here, there's got to be three deals. There's got to be a deal between the U.S. and Iran, in which the Europeans join. There's got to be a deal within Iran between the moderates who are negotiating this and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps and the Quds Force, who have invested a huge amount in this nuclear program, a vast nuclear program. And to get the clerics to go along as well, starting with the supreme leader, who in the end will be the one making the decision. And then there's got to be a third deal here in the United States between the White House and a Congress that found it very easy to put sanctions on Iran, and they did that many times, and that's driven the Iranians to the table, to then get them to turn around and take sanctions off and try to go out into the middle of the country someplace, having just voted for relaxing sanctions on Iran, and explain that in a midterm election. That's a toughie. And all three of these agreements have to meet together at roughly the same time.
So that is going to be indeed a huge challenge. But when we look at Iran's role in Syria, it's clear we have to have a way to talk to them about Syria. And I wonder if, Stephen, if you can talk a little about some of the other external actors in Syria. And I mention this because I think Syria is more than just about Syria. It's essentially ignited an entire region-wide struggle. There are issues between Sunnis and Shia. That has always been there in Iraq, but I think it has been it is much worse today as a result of Syria. But we're seeing these Sunni-Shia conflicts play out in northern Yemen right now. We see the Saudis very concerned about their East Province, where the Shia live. And part of it is, of course, their concern about the emergence of Iran as a possible nuclear power, but it seems to me there's something else in the water, and that is this outbreak of sectarianism. And if we don't tamp it down in Syria, I'm kind of worried about where it's going. And in the absence of any Egyptian leadership, the Turks have stepped in, and Stephen, I'd be curious what you think about whether the Arabs really want to listen to Turks as they did for some 400 years. Anyway, if you could take that one away and run with it.
The Iran situation is developing in a very interesting way, but I certainly agree with David. We've got real problems inside the United States on that issue, and they've certainly got the sort of a comparable problem inside Iran. It's difficult to sell this reality that actually Iranian interests over the long run have a lot more in common with American interests than interests of some of our so-called allies in that region. Iran has a great ability to influence events in Iraq, in Syria, in Afghanistan. Iran is, of course, the bitter enemy of radical Sunni movements like the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. They were against the Taliban when we were still friends with the Taliban. So I think Iran does have the ability to play a calming role, which is a very different role from the role they've been playing up to now. I certainly agree with you that the incitement of sectarian tension in Syria is having a tremendous ripple effect throughout the region. It's very distressing. In a way, it's showing we're finally catching up with the mistakes that those British diplomats made in Pall Mall a few nights when they were drawing those lines on maps. A lot of those lines really didn't make any sense, and for a lot of reasons they held together for a long time, but maybe reality is surging forward.
But give some credit to the French for that.
Okay, I'll be happy to do that. Certainly in Syria they did that.
Yeah.
There was also a little bit of drinking going on while they were drawing those lines. Let's face it.
In Britain? No, not on Pall Mall in those men's clubs. Richard Holbrooke, the only time I ever heard Richard Holbrooke share credit for anything that he accomplished was when he told me that it wasn't just him who had made Slobodan Milosevic surrender at Dayton. He said it was me and Johnny Walker. I want to point out the one aspect of the difficult puzzle in Iran that David referred to, and that's the Revolutionary Guard. The Revolutionary Guard has really become a hugely powerful force now. And I'm seeing something in Iran under sanctions that I also saw in Serbia under sanctions. And that is that all the goods that are banned by sanctions still arrive in the marketplace. You don't prevent them from coming in. It just means that they get more expensive. Only certain people can buy them. But what's most important is that when you have heavy sanctions like we've had on Iran and like we had on Serbia, a new class emerges, and that's the sanctions busters. They're people who make money by smuggling, essentially, by violating international sanctions. And in Iran, the principal group doing that is the Revolutionary Guards. They are the ones running the speedboats across the Persian Gulf from Dubai many times a day. And they have become hugely rich and powerful because of this, and the sanctions are their bread and butter. They live from those. So they're naturally going to be opposed to any reconciliation. And in fact, our sanctions are what has enriched the Revolutionary Guards. We're the ones that have helped promote the Revolutionary Guards to this position of such tremendous power in Iran. It's another example of this blowback that sometimes we don't see in advance. Now, could we get to the point where Iran can serve as a regional stabilizer rather than as a regional destabilizer? I find this a very intriguing possibility. It certainly would be a change from their behavior in recent decades. On the other hand, they have had a lot of stick and not much carrot from us up to now. I think from my visits to Iran that the public there is looking for a way out. There's a tremendous disconnect between what Iran should be and what Iran is. This is a huge country. It's the country right in the middle of the Middle East. And I think it's in some ways analogous to Germany in Europe. If after World War II we had followed that original Morgenthau plan where we wanted to turn Germany into an agricultural country and to never allow it to have a factory ever again, we would have turned Germany into another angry country, just like it had been before the Second World War. But cooler heads prevailed, and we went in another direction, the Marshall Plan, with great results. I'd like to see some kind of a similar approach to Iran, a recognition that although there's a lot of anti-Iran emotion in this country, and much of it is justified, in the long run, if you put aside your emotion, you see that you're not going to be able to solve these regional problems without Iran. Now, the great reluctance to bringing Iran into a serious negotiation in which we would talk not just about the nuclear issue, but about regional issues, has been the fear that if we do that, the final settlement will reflect, in part, Iran's interests. And we will be raising Iran's ability to influence the course of events in that region. And I think that's a correct, I don't want to call it a fear, but that's a correct assessment. That's what would happen. So I think we need to make a decision about whether we are ready to accept Iran as a player in the Middle East. If we are going to build a new security architecture in the Middle East, Iran will have to be a part of it. Every country has to have a place there if there's going to be some kind of stability. Can Iran be drawn into a security architecture in which its interests will be respected, but the interests of other countries will also have to be respected? I'm not quite sure we are ready for this yet. There's a tremendous emotional drawback from both the American side and the Iranian side. Emotions have clouded this for so long. And emotion is always the enemy of wise statesmanship. If we can leave that behind, which is a huge if, and if we can recognize that Iran can play a role in calming Shiite anger, as it has played a role in fomenting Shiite anger, then I think the possibility of bringing Iran in as an important regional player will increase. I'll say this, that in the past, not under the Obama administration, but under the previous administration, there was a rule that nobody could ever even refer to the concept of Iran's security interests or legitimate security interests or fears that Iran might have. What it meant was we don't want to take Iran's concerns into consideration because we want to crush Iran. We don't want to empower Iran. And there's fear that bringing Iran to the negotiating table as an equal will empower Iran. And actually, I think that's a legitimate fear, or it's a legitimate prediction. That's what would happen. So we have a huge trust gap with Iran right now. And the way to get past that is to find ways that we find verification mechanisms so that we can be absolutely sure that we know what's going on in the Iranian nuclear program. And if we can do that, then we open up the possibility for the United States to take many steps that I think could spread beyond Iran, and one of them might be an ability to try to negotiate a settlement in Syria.
But I want to go back to David on this issue of what we can do about that Iran nuclear program. But at the end of the day, my sense is we cannot live with a nuclear Iran. It's simply too dangerous for the region. David?
You know, one of the interesting arguments that you hear kicked around is, could you contain a nuclear Iran? After all, we contained the Soviet Union with a much larger, much bigger nuclear threat for many, many years. The argument and the conclusion that President Obama came to, really the first year of his presidency, was that containment wouldn't work because of what would happen throughout the rest of the region. So, as soon as Iran got a weapon, the Saudis would be among the first of the Arab states that would want to go match it. And fortunately for the Saudis, they have an easy route to do this. It does not involve hiring scientists and spinning centrifuges for 20 years. They funded the Pakistani nuclear program and AQ Khan for a long time. They didn't do it because they are members of the Sisters of Charity. And, at some moment or another, if they need it, I think there is there's a widespread sense in the U.S. government that they could, in fact, call on the Pakistanis to deliver one. Now, would the U.S. see that? Maybe. WikiLeaks and the Snowden papers have been filled with all kinds of details about the degree to which the U.S. keeps an eye on the nuclear program in Pakistan. But certainly it is a legitimate concern that if the Iranians get a weapon, the Saudis, the UAE, many other countries would go after it as well because they would need to match a Shia bomb with a Sunni bomb. In fact, in WikiLeaks, one of my favorite cables, one the State Department asked us if we would not publish because they thought it would embarrass the King of Saudi Arabia, was when the King suggested that what the U.S. had to do with Iran was cut off the head of the snake.
I love that one.
And
you went with that, though, right?
We went with that, and we went with it because there were many things that we cut out that had a real security concern.
You went with a lot of my cables, I'll tell you that. I mean,
We wanted yours to be...
I don't need to write a book. I just need to take the New York Times leaking of my cables.
We were looking for all that kind of vivid wording, and Chris, since you're such a natural writer, we were able to mine yours for so much.
That was Eric Girl's problem. Too good a writer.
But when we went through these, I mean, we said, look, it's not as if somebody's going to come to the King of Saudi Arabia and depose him on the grounds that he said about Iran what he really thought. And I think the benefit of these cables was that people discovered that it was the Saudis as much as the Israelis who were really set to go after the Iranians on the nuclear program. And it's interesting because it's the Saudis now, by turning down a seat on the Security Council and so forth, who have made it clear that they're unhappy with the U.S. on several fronts, on not sufficiently arming the rebels in Syria, on allowing Mubarak to leave office. It's in their view, it was Obama who threw Mubarak under the bus. It's not where my reporting has taken me. I think Mubarak threw Mubarak under the bus. I think Obama backed the bus up over him a few times. But that's a different thing. And it's because the Saudis saw in what happened to Mubarak a fear that could, in fact, one day be their fate if the United States decided that they were no longer a useful ally. And I don't think the U.S. has taken any move in that direction. But the key, I think, in these Iran negotiations is to try to unlock the region in a way where Iran does not become a regional destabilizer. Yeah. And that's what's got to follow after the nuclear side.
Right. I want, Steve, you can follow up on that, but Stephen, I also want to hear what you think of Turkey's role, because you've talked about the challenge of making a regional destabilizer into a regional stabilizer, but it seems that what Turkey has done in some of these circumstances is to go from being a regional stabilizer to one that really doesn't play well with others.
Let me make a few comments, then I want to get to that. First of all, I think there is a sort of a Saudi Arabia-Israel axis emerging here. They fall into the same category of friends of ours that spit in our face all the time. And I think they're seeing something in common there. I want to mention something that I was told in a small meeting with one of the principal Israeli political figures. I can't mention his name, but this a guy that both of us would know very well, both of my fellow panelists.
But if I mention it, then you would publish it, right?
Yeah. Only if it's in one of your cables. Okay. he gave a little talk to a small group of us, and he said, you know, you're all reading in your home countries about how terrified Israel is of Iran getting a nuclear weapon because as soon as they get one, they're going to bomb us. He said, actually, that's half true. We are terrified of it, but not for that reason. We don't contradict that view because it sounds logical, but that's actually not what we believe. We don't fear that Iran would bomb us after having a nuclear weapon, but we have two other great fears. One is exactly the one David mentions. As soon as Iran has one, you've got Saudi Arabia, you've got Turkey, would have had Egypt if Egypt was still alive.
They're otherwise occupied right now, yeah.
So that's one reason. But I think there's also, but this guy then mentioned another reason. He said, once you have a nuclear weapon, you don't have to use it. You're able to intimidate your neighbors in a much more effective way. And of course, the Israelis would know this very well. So I think that's another reason why there's a great fear of this. And I just want to comment on and reinforce something that David said. I think in the U.S., the right-left divide over intervention versus non-intervention is not useful anymore. These things are falling apart. I just read the other day that Governor Christie of New Jersey made a statement, maybe it was off the cuff, it was the first thing I'd ever heard him say about foreign policy. And he was criticizing a comment by Rand Paul, who said something about how we need to lessen our involvement in our interventions in other parts of the world. And he said something like, I'm paraphrasing him now, if he had been here on September 11th and seen those dead bodies and the screams of the widows and the anguish that we felt, he would never say that. We have to go out there and crush these people. And that's the moderate now. He's the centrist. Yeah. And Rand Paul is the wacko on the end. So I think the old political division is falling down. And I think
Sort of makes you wish for those days when foreign policy in New Jersey was how you deal with New York.
And the Port Authority. That was enough. Let me talk about Turkey. I think you're absolutely right. Turkey emerged, I think, for the first 10 of Tayyip Erdogan's 12 years now in power, is really a model power, and I thought it had a very wise and far-reaching foreign policy. But I think Turkey, partly because of Prime Minister Erdogan's personal sense of pique, has gone off on what I consider an excessively emotion-driven course with two countries. The first is Israel, and the second is Syria. Let me just parenthetically say this. Tayyip Erdogan, the Prime Minister of Turkey, grew up in a neighborhood of Istanbul that I came to know, a place called Kasim Pasha. It's a pretty tough neighborhood. It's a place that's famous in Turkey. You'll sometimes hear when somebody in a factory isn't working, won't talk to anyone, is doing everything and pushing everyone away, they'll say, oh, a Kasim Pasha guy. It's a place where people are known for a prickly sense of honor, easily offended, quick to fight, and I think Erdogan has some of this. After the Mavi Marmara episode, and even before that with the caste-led invasions, the invasion first of Lebanon, but then afterwards of Gaza, Erdogan let his emotions take control of him, I think, and he got very angry at Israel. And we lost something because of that. We lost a bridge that we need. Israel is going to need to climb out of its isolation at some point, and Turkey would have been the logical bridge over which it could go, and it doesn't have that bridge now, and I lament that. I also think that Turkey has gone too far on the Syria issue. I think Syria has lost its ability to be a mediator because I think Tayyip Erdogan had Bashar al-Assad 20 times in Turkey with their wives. They would sit and sun themselves at Tayyip Erdogan's beach house in Antalya. They thought they understood each other. And then when the trouble started in Syria, Erdogan essentially called him with some advice, and Bashar al-Assad told him to drop dead and hung up the phone. When you're from Kasim Pasha, you don't put up with that. So I lament these two turns of Turkish foreign policy. The excessively emotional break with Israel and the excessively emotional push to support the opposition in Syria. I must say that on the latter one, I think slowly they're cooling down. They're realizing that the Syria opposition is evolving in ways that are not good for Turkey. We just saw in the last 48 hours, for the first time, Turkey intercepted a weapons shipment that was going across the border to certain what were considered to be jihadist groups inside Syria.
It was bomb-making material.
Exactly, it was bomb-making material. And I think the Turks are realizing, talk about blowback, before blowback gets here, it's going to get to Turkey. So I'm hoping that Turkey
will resume the role that it played for much of this century, and it's a role that no other country in that region can play.
David, I'm not asking you to write another book, maybe Inheritance 2, but I wonder if you could, we've just discussed a lot of these not very fun problems in the Middle East. I mean, what is the Obama administration going to be able to do about some of these in its remaining time, and what is it going to turn over to the next administration?
Well, Confront and Conceal was an effort to sort of write what in the first term they did, with what they inherited. And I think that a year later, I would have to say that things that had looked pretty promising at the time of the presidential election last year look a whole lot less promising today. And not all of these are President Obama's fault. I mean, we have to acknowledge the fact that because the United States does not control events around the world as much as people would like, conspiracy theorists would like to think, sometimes bad things happen over which we have absolutely no control. And the question is, which ones do you decide to pick and fight? And I think one of the interesting things that President Obama has done in the decision first to pull out of Iraq, then to do the surge into Afghanistan that he regretted almost immediately and started up an internal White House committee whose name said it all. It was the Afghan Good Enough Committee. And that's the one that ended up setting the deadline for the withdrawal at the end of next year from Afghanistan, which will probably be a pretty full withdrawal. At most, we would have a few thousand forces left. I think the president was quite serious in wanting to make the pivot to Asia real. And I can understand why he would want to go do that. There's sort of three reasons. First of all, one's track record in diplomacy in the Middle East is, the American track record is not all that great. We are without any influence in Iraq right now. We're not going to have a lot of influence in Pakistan and Afghanistan after we leave Afghanistan. John Kerry came in absolutely convinced that he wanted to go restart the Palestinian-Israeli negotiations, on which the Obama administration had done, by its own admission, a very poor job in the first year. And I think what everybody in the White House, the first 4 years, and I think what everybody in the White House said was, we think that's a fabulous idea. Why don't you go out there and go do this and send a postcard if any of this is working out? What's interesting about the Kerry approach to this is that if you think about where the president has set his priorities, it doesn't quite line up. The president has said number one priority is a return to Asia where we had always been present but were underinvested. And then in the Middle East, to go deal with Iran, number one, problems like Egypt and Syria, number two, and the Palestinian-Israeli issues, number three. So you have the Secretary of State extremely wrapped up in the midst of the number three problem in the number two region in the world. And that does make you wonder a little bit about the coordination. The one area where the president, I think, was doing particularly well was in deepening the relationship with some traditional allies, particularly in Europe, even after the European economic crisis. And I think part of the reason he wanted to do the pivot to Asia was that he recognized that Europe was not going to be a place of great growth or investment, and Asia was going to be. But unfortunately, when you think back to those days when huge crowds gathered near the Brandenburg Gate, cheering Obama in the 2008 campaign and then again on his return, today you would see a much smaller crowd and they would all be waving their cell phones. And they wouldn't be waving them entirely out of happiness. And so this takes you to what some of the damage of the Snowden revelations were. And by saying the damage of the revelations, I don't mean, as some government officials do, that the damage came from the fact that it was revealed. The damage, I think, came from the underlying policies where, as Chris indicated before, the cost-benefit analysis was a little bit elusive. And I think that that roots itself in the way the United States has looked at its priorities since 9/11. We have been a very threat-based foreign policy from 9/11 forward. And in fact, when you look at the intelligence agency's national priorities list, which the president approves, it's in 5 tiers. So tier 1, you can figure out pretty easily. You know, it's Al-Qaeda, it's trafficking in nuclear weapons. Tier 2 might be state of the Iranian economy, to know whether the sanctions are affecting them enough to drive them to the table, or state of the North Korean economy, or future of China's economic growth, political activities. Those are the only 2 tiers that get briefed up to the White House on a regular basis. Tiers 3, 4, and 5 might include, say, the automatic listening in on the cell phone of an allied leader like Angela Merkel. And we now know from the documents that the tap on her phone started in 2002. Why was that interesting? Because she wasn't even chancellor in 2002. She was the leader of the Social Democrats. She had the Christian Democrats. I'm sorry. There was no way to know that she was going to emerge as the chancellor in 2 years, and she was just on a list of probably 100 or 200 German officials whose calls they were intercepting. And this was during the Bush administration. When the Obama administration came in, nobody stopped and said, let's do a cost-benefit analysis of whether it is worth spying on partners who we also rely on. And boy, do we rely on the Germans. There are al-Qaeda cells in a lot of German cities. Olympic Games, which I referred to before, the cyber program against Iran, a lot of that involved German intelligence. In fact, a lot of the equipment that the Iranians purchased was from Siemens, a German producer, and the Iranians would call up the Siemens handyman every once in a while and have him come in to fix it. That was extremely useful to U.S. intelligence, as you can imagine, because he came with all kinds of things. The Germans have been absolutely critical in cyber protection efforts to try to make sure that malware doesn't get into the overall networks. And yet no one then asks the question, is there a cost if you're also targeting your partners? And I think one of the biggest decisions the president's going to have to make between now and probably 3 or 4 months from now is whether or not to really change American foreign policy in some places, particularly in Germany, maybe not in places Steve knows much better than I do, like Brazil and Mexico, and say, you know, you can't target your allies.
Stephen, I wonder, I mean, this is looking pretty grim. The Obama administration, as we described, is just a couple of years to go, and I'm not seeing a lot of accomplishments here. What do you think could be kind of there as a something that was successful?
Well, I agree with David. I think the Israel-Palestine negotiations is a losing bet. I wouldn't put. I'd wait for that postcard, but other than that,
you got to try.
Don't get your hopes up.
Right, but,
I'll tell you. First of all, let me make one comment on the spying thing. I think we've gotten into this mindset that our technology has gotten so good that we might as well use it. We feel everything that we can do, we might as well do. Otherwise, why do we have the technology? But the technology is getting so advanced, we really need to have another kind of a break on that policy and ask ourselves, just because we can do it, do we really want to do it? And the other piece of this is that we should realize now something that, say, Eisenhower and the Dulles brothers had reason not to believe, which is that this stuff is always going to come out. You know, Eisenhower, I think, could look you right in the eye like John Foster Dulles could and say, I don't know what you're talking about. We intervened in Iran, Guatemala. I don't know anything about it. And could really believe no one's ever going to find out. In the modern age, that's not true. So that makes this cost-benefit analysis even more important. As for possible achievements, you know, I'm going to go back to one that we've already talked about if we're talking about the Middle East. To me, the real big breakthrough that we could imagine achieving, and that would be substantially beneficial for our security, would be with Iran. I think that Iran has a great deal to offer the U.S. in terms of parallel security interests. And the Iranian public is embarrassingly pro-American. I tell you, I have had this over and over again when I'm there.
People shriek on street corners when they find out that I'm an American. One woman came up to me on the corner when I was in Shiraz the last time, and she said, "I know they say terrible things about us over there, but we love America so much." You don't even get that in Canada. This pro-American sentiment among the Iranian public is a great strategic asset for us. As David pointed out, there's some obstacles inside Iran. Nonetheless, I think the raw material is out there in the Iranian public in a way that it's not out there in the American public for reconciliation. Send Tom Pickering to Iran and let him see what he can do would be my advice. We're actually, I think we're starting along that road. And if I were Obama, I would pursue that one as vigorously as possible. I think that's the place where not only a breakthrough is conceivable, not probable, but it's one that, if it could be reached, might potentially have considerable impact throughout the region.
Okay. David, I'd like you to pick up on that, but I'd also like you to speak to the issue of China, which is a fairly important country in the world. And I guess let me pose it this way. Should we be worried about China's strength, as a lot of our think tankers in Washington talk about? Should we be worried about their strength? Or when you look at the myriad of problems they have, the provinces, the slower growth, the kind of disconnect between their political system and their economy, or should we be more worried about their weakness?
You know, Chris, it's a great question, and it's such a great question that it was on my list, and I gave it to President Bush when I went down to go interview him a few days before his first inauguration in 2001. We were down at the ranch there, and this was, the New York Times, supposed to be serious interview, marred a little bit by the fact that one of our photographers, bearing very heavy equipment, stepped back on what he thought was a rug and turned out to be Barney the dog. Barney survived the incident, but for years the kids portion of the White House website noted that Barney was once nearly killed by a New York Times photographer. But at some point in the course of the interview, I asked him that very same question. Should we be more concerned about a strong China or a weak China? And he looked at me and he said, "Is that a trick question?" So I look at you now and I ask the same thing. Is that a trick question? And the answer to my mind is, I think we have much more to be worried about a weak China than a strong one. And that doesn't mean that there are not challenges from China's territorial efforts in recent times or China's cyber attacks, which I'll come back to. But in the end, for all of the things that we are discussing about the Obama administration, 25 years from now, my guess is that the only thing in the foreign policy world that will truly make a huge difference is whether the president got China right. And I think that's part of the reason that he went off to try to go do the Asian pivot, which was both send some boundaries around the Chinese so they understood where they couldn't go, what allies we would stick with, but also show the Chinese that the U.S. regarded them as an absolutely critical economic partner. And the fact that they are such a big investor in American treasuries changes the dynamic. It's not at all the same dynamic you have seen in other superpower issues. In fact, one of my favorite lines from WikiLeaks, apart from the Saudi king, was when Hillary Clinton went to go see the Australian Prime Minister for the first time in 2009, and her next stop was Beijing, and according to the note taker, she leaned over to him halfway through and said, "So how do you talk toughly to your banker?" Very good question. In China's case, if the slowdown that we all fear happens, it's going to take offline the one big growth locomotive in the world economy today, because it ain't us and it ain't the Europeans and it certainly isn't the Middle East. So that's, I think, the big concern at that end. The second one is that we want to try to have enough of a relationship with the Chinese that we can bring them into world standards of how you behave on international markets, which was what their entry into the WTO was supposed to accomplish, and what their entry into other Western trading partnerships was supposed to accomplish. But the thing about the Chinese is they're so big that when they come into these groups, they believe, rightly so, that they can change the rules to their liking, and frequently they can. On the downside of Chinese power, we were making significant progress, I think, in highlighting the amount of intellectual property theft and other cyber attacks that come from China each and every day. The scope of them, how they got everything from the F-35, the Joint Strike Fighter blueprints, to many industrial secrets, to the details of gas pipelines. And I was lucky enough to be part of a team at the Times that did the reporting earlier this year on Unit 61398, which is the PLA unit that basically does a lot of this kind of hacking. The difficulty is that the Snowden events basically took that whole narrative offline and gave the Chinese an excuse to say, well, you're doing what we're doing. Well, actually, we're not. We're not doing industrial espionage. We are doing the cell phone for Angela Merkel, and it's a little hard to explain, and I'm sure if we're listening to her, we're probably listening to the Chinese leadership as well. But it has thrown off track what I think was probably the most important line of discussion underway between the Chinese and the U.S. other than the North Korea discussion.
Could I ask you a question, David? So you're in Washington. I avoid Washington like the plague. So I want to ask you a question about our future foreign policy in general. So when I travel the world, one thing that always impresses me is that despite all of America's sins over the years, there's a huge reservoir of goodwill for the United States. People tremendously admire us in almost all of the world. They envy us. They see what we've achieved, and they'd like some of that for themselves. We have a great story to tell. I don't think we actually tell it very well. Much of the rhetoric seems always to be about snarling and red lines and threats and all options on the table. But nonetheless, there's a great reservoir of goodwill towards the United States out there. Now, since we have this image to sell, people think, wouldn't we like to be more like the United States? We'd like to hear what the United States has to say and maybe try to follow some of their advice so we can get to be more like them. What about what's happened in Washington in the last few months? Does that change people's opinion and make them think, gee, maybe the United States does not have the kind of political system that we should aspire to have?
Well, I think they certainly worry about the execution of our foreign policy, and that's, you don't see many people signing up for the Chinese system, except for the fact that the Chinese have been pretty good on execution.
Literally or figuratively?
You'll have to define that. Although I think the environmental issues have been like a great, have really, in some ways, impinged on the Chinese reputation there. What's the appeal, Steve, of the U.S. when you hear that, when you hear it from Iranians? When I was based in Asia, you'd go, see anti-American protests in the morning, and then the same people would be lining up for student visas in the afternoon, which is, always a great scene. The appeal is the universities, the entrepreneurship, the culture, the movies, the music, and the sense of freedom once you're here.
And does the government shutdown overwhelm some of that?
I don't think it really does, because I think people sort of segment why they want to live in America versus whether they want the United States government lecturing to them. And there are not many people who want the U.S. government lecturing to them. And that's what I think was the fundamental problem we had when the Bush administration would talk about exporting American-style democracy. It's really what the second inaugural address by Bush was all about. And what have we learned over the years? That democracy is a fabulous import if you want it, and the American system a fabulous import if you want it. But it's a really crummy export. People don't want to be told that your system should look more like our system. Because our system, as we've seen in the past few months, could bear a little improvement here and there, just around the edges. Yeah. And I think one thing that Obama has gotten right is that he has not lectured to countries about why they should be more like us. One thing as a country we have gotten wrong, I think, is that we haven't yet developed a cohesive immigration policy that would enable those who want to come into the country and contribute to actually be able to go do it. You know, Tom Friedman used to write about taking every engineer that we turned out of our grad schools and stapling a green card to their diploma. And yet we can't bring ourselves to go do that.
We've got a few more minutes, and what I'd like to do is maybe get some questions from the audience. I understand from Danny we don't have a microphone, so if you can speak up, and I'll try to repeat the question. Well, why don't we try that? So, any questions? Yes?
Yes, I'd like to ask Mr. Kinzer whether he really believes the Israelis spit in the face of the U.S. And secondly, in his restructuring of the Iranian government, does he have a plan to bring back the Shah?
Question for Mr. Kinzer. Does he really believe that the Israelis spit at our face? And secondly, in the restructuring of the Iranian government, is there a plan to bring back the Shah or the Shah's relatives? Because otherwise that would be kind of difficult. But
I feel when I saw the Secretary of State of the United States arriving, stepping down from his airplane and being told right then that the Israelis have just announced the plans to have a new settlement in East Jerusalem, I thought, this is an example of maybe spitting in the face is not the right gentle phrase to use, but it's certainly the kind of behavior that we would not tolerate from a lot of other countries. And this kind of thing happens repeatedly. I think there's a sense among what I feel is a growing part of the Israeli public that the U.S. and Israel are going off in different directions. I find this dangerous. I find it troubling. Nonetheless, I see that perhaps to play to that growing anti-American audience in Israel, some Israeli leaders feel the necessity to seem like they're standing up to the United States and they're resisting the United States. And that's caused some friction in this relationship. As for the future of leaders of Iran, I can see an evolution in Iran, but I don't see it going back to royal rule. And I certainly don't see a role for the Pahlavi family there. You know, Iran has is what I call the post-utopian society in the Middle East. Other countries may be getting there, but when I saw everything exploding in Egypt and everything exploding in other Arab countries, and I heard this wave of optimism. We're finally going to break free of dictatorship, and there's going to be democracy in a couple of years in our country. I thought, you know, you should call your friends in Iran, because they went through this. They had a revolution in which all segments of society participated, even though they hated each other, because they all agreed on one thing, that no matter what we get, and we don't know what it's going to be, it's definitely going to be better than what we had. But what happened? They got something worse. This has been a profound experience for Iranians, and they are now, I think, certainly in the Middle East and perhaps the world, the leading proponents of the Shakespearean idea that it is better to bear those ills you know than flying to others that you know not of. In a sense, Iran is one of the most stable societies in that part of the world, and I can see it evolving, but I don't see a sudden break, and only a sudden break would allow an opening for a return to royal rule.
Heather?
So I have a question for David. Mostly in regards to laying another level of complexity on the negotiations in the region, particularly with regard to the light footprint approach. So how do you see cyber attacks against Iran and us losing drones in Iran and then reverse engineering them and then proliferating drone technology throughout the region, and then how that weapons technology is actually creating another enemy or creating a bigger boogeyman for us to deal with, aside from the nuclear issue, but this is another level of weapons.
So this question for David Sanger really about the possibility that in sending drones over Iran, they get shot down, they could be reverse engineered, and what is our, how do we see the eventual fact that some of these could be used by other entities, I guess,
as well as the cyber.
And
right.
The cyber side as well. By the way, Heather is an expert on drones, cyber, and Kant. And I was hoping for a question on the Enlightenment and Kant, but all right, we went with drones and cyber.
I didn't realize that Kant was into cyber, but it's a...
We can't know.
So it's a very good question. And so I think the way you have to think about this is that the light footprint worked really well in the first term, and it's run out of gas or running out of gas in the second term. So let's take drones first, because it's a much easier technology to go replicate. Okay? Anybody here have an idea how many drone attacks on Pakistan alone there were in the entire Bush administration? Just yell it out if you think you've got a number.
80.
80? 20? 8 years of the Bush administration. 100. There were 48. Okay, now, first 4 years of the Obama administration, January 20th, 2009 to this past January 20th, in Pakistan alone. Very good, 300. So it was a six-fold increase, which gives you, this was not a statistic that the Democratic Coordinating Committee, used a whole lot in the campaign. And it gave you a sense of the degree of their reliance on it, but there was this problem that the more you use them, and I think they're a very accurate weapon and more accurate to use than, say, dropping a bomb from a B-52, but there were definitely civilian casualties. There was definitely a sense that you would create in Pakistan and Yemen and other places many of the resentments you worried about. And then there was the Iranian problem. And one day, a drone, an unarmed drone, sped up, thought it was moving at 20,000 miles an hour, or so the computer indication said, and landed in the Iranian desert. And there were all these emergency meetings in the White House in which they looked at photographs and they saw that it landed in a place where there were a bunch of sheep herders, and they thought, well, we'll just leave it there. Maybe no one will find it. Then they thought about blowing it up, and they discovered that it's covered with this kind of material to make it stealthy that only burns at 2,000 degrees, and the fire they would create would probably incinerate a few of the sheep. So, in fact, the Iranians got it. The Iranians have their own crewed drones these days. If they want to buy more, they should go check in with the Chinese, who have very good drones. The Israelis have drones. I was in Israel in March or April, and Netanyahu was up in his helicopter one day while I was there, and they brought it down because a Hamas drone had come over the border. Very small, unarmed, but they wanted to take the time to blow it up before they got there. So we are past the moment when this issue, the question was out there, could others replicate the technology? They're replicating it.
No, it was more the layer of complexity of the proliferation.
Right. So the proliferation of it is then going to require us to come to the conclusion about whether or not there can be some kind of an international understanding of how you use these, just as we have international understandings of how you use nuclear and chemical and biological and landmines and so forth, not all of which the U.S. has signed on to. And I think ultimately we're probably going to have to head to that moment. Is it a big threat to the United States itself? No, because they're fairly slow moving. Cyber is much more complicated. And I described in my accounting of Olympic Games how President Obama himself raised the question, do we want to be developing cyber weapons if it becomes an excuse for the Chinese or for the Russians or others to do the same? Or the Iranians. And of course it's the Iranians who have, though he didn't raise the Iranians as a possibility, it's an Iranian cyber attack that hit Saudi Aramco and shut down 30,000 computers summer before last. The Iranians have done denial of service attacks on U.S. banks. And this is a much harder problem because it's not just states that hold the cyber weapons. Criminal groups do. Terror groups could. They haven't yet. And teenagers can. And teenagers don't sign treaties Or let me put this another way. The teenagers who live in my household seem unwilling to sign treaties. What that tells you is that this is going to be a much harder proliferation problem to control. And my own view is that the United States government can't begin to have that conversation until it admits that it is developing and deploying cyber weapons. And so far, they have been very reluctant to do so.
All right, I'll take one more question, but we really have to move because we're really getting to the end of the hour here, or hour and a half actually. But I do want to say that the books are where they're
Straight back there. Dawn
so right here, and I think both Stephen and David have agreed to do some signing. So if you want to buy a book there, yes, ma'am.
I wonder, Mr. Kinzer, if you feel that there's a Cold War going on now between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and if so, what are the implications for U.S. foreign policy? I see big implications for Syria. And currently, supposedly, the one country is our friend and the other is our enemy, and you suggested that that needs to change, at least on the Iran side. You've also sort of hinted that our friendship with Saudi Arabia is, maybe a little questionable too when Saudi Arabia has done some of these counter-war interests. So I just wondered if you could speak to that. Do you see a Cold War there?
Absolutely. I think one of the ways you can see events in the Middle East over these last few years is through the lens of Iran versus Saudi Arabia. So much of what's happening is in some way connected either to one country or the other, or the competition between the two of them. Now, it has always been assumed that Saudi Arabia has an advantage in this Cold War, as you call it, because it has the United States as its unquestioning ally. But that may be changing. And I think this is one of the things that's panicking Saudi Arabia. You're seeing kind of a near apoplexy in Saudi Arabia, which I think is even more extreme than it is in Israel. Israelis have a little more self-confidence and I think a greater confidence in their own stability than Saudi Arabia does.
200 nuclear weapons of their own.
Makes a little difference.
Yeah.
So I see the Saudis suddenly fearing that in this competition they've had with Iran for several years, which is actually quite intense, the great asset on which they have relied might be slipping away from them. At the same time, they're having the signals of internal problems. The Security Council situation where they campaigned for years to get the seat, and then after they got it in the middle of the night, they announced they weren't doing it, they didn't want it, tells me that there's tremendous conflict within the ruling family, because the only person that could have made that final decision was the king. The king is 89 years old, although we don't know exactly. He's got that suspiciously black hair and black beard, but I wouldn't be fooled by that. I see even the possibility of a succession crisis in the kingdom, and I think maybe many of the princes see that themselves. And this, tied to the changing relationship between Washington and Riyadh, I think is considerably unsettling Saudi Arabia. And when they see the United States seeming to flirt with Iran, that adds just another layer to it. So that is a destabilizing factor, but I think in the long run it could be destabilizing in a positive way.
Okay. Well, with great regret, we have to wrap this up, but let me just say this has been a fabulous discussion by these two just extraordinary journalists, and I have to give a plug to the New York Times. I mean, this is what you get when you shell out the, what is it, $7.95 to be online or something. I mean, it's really tremendous. But fortunately, the New York Times has allowed these gentlemen a little time to write books from now and again, and so I think some of them are present in the back. But I just want to thank you so much. It's been wonderful. I think, David, you're going to be speaking at the Denver World Affairs Council later this evening. I know Stephen is going to be speaking actually here again at the university at 5 o'clock. I'm not sure.
Right here in this room.
But with whom? What is he?
All by himself.
Okay, all right. But anyway, thank you so much for making your way to Denver, and we're just really thrilled and honored to have you. So thank you both.
Great. Thank you.